In today's America, it's not uncommon at all to see Confederate monuments being pulled down or removed from public view. Most of these memorials were raised between 1880 and 1930 with great fanfare and support from civic and political leaders of the local community. Something has happened in the years since. For the next few minutes, let's explore what is going on in the United States today that would cause this cultural cleansing of Southern society of its once noble hero. Very few people in American history have had more books and articles written about them or speeches given in praise of them than Confederate General Robert E. Lee. Yet from New Orleans, Louisiana to Charlottesville, Virginia, a full frontal attack has been launched against his memorials. He is not the only Southerner under attack, but the very fact that his monuments are being successfully attacked gives notice that no memorial to any Confederate soldier is safe. Who is attacking these monuments, and what is their ultimate desire and goal? In the last decade of the 20th century, the NAACP, having successfully destroyed racial discrimination in the United States, needed a new reason for its existence. It appears that they took a look around and determined that slandering the history of the South by attacking the Confederate flag and monuments could be used to keep their followers busy and money flowing into their organization. But there were other left-wing groups, such as Antifa, that perhaps saw in this attack upon the Confederacy a chance to attack not just Southern history and heritage, but also an attack in American and Western history and culture. These neo-Marxists were no doubt eager to attack anything and everything that had for so long stood in the way of the advancement of their secular humanist Marxist worldview. The Confederate States of America was just the low-hanging fruits they needed to get the ball rolling in the cultural cleansing of America. Now let's talk about those monuments. The neo-Marxists proclaimed that these monuments were established as memorials to white supremacy. But what are the facts? Ron, can you help us here? Tell us about the Confederate monuments in Jackson, Mississippi.
Oh, that's a great one. That's a beautiful monument. It was built back in 1891 and it was funded by the state legislature of Mississippi and also by private donations. It honors all Confederate veterans regardless of their race. This is not a monument to white Confederates. It's a monument to all Confederates, black, red, brown, yellow, as well as white Confederates. Interesting enough, Representative John Harris of Washington County, Mississippi, a black Confederate veteran, spoke in favor of the monument. He declared on the House floor in the state legislature chamber in Mississippi, "I too wore the gray, the same gray color that my master wore. And if that war was going on to this very day, I too would be there. I want to vote for this monument, and I want to honor all those who wore the gray." All of the African American members in the Mississippi legislature voted for the erecting of that monument. That monument is a monument to all of our people. It could be considered as a healing monument, showing how our people work together to raise that monument, black and white. Now, Donald, this is not the only monument. Tell us about the Confederate monuments at Arlington Cemetery there in Washington, D.C.
As shocking as this is to most Americans, Ron, even Southerners are shocked by the fact that in Arlington National Cemetery, right outside of Washington, D.C., where you have the tomb of the unknown soldier buried, there is a monument to Confederate veterans. What is really interesting, Ron, is that carved in relief on that monument on the side are figures of Confederate soldiers and Confederate women of the South during the war. And some of those soldiers and the women are African American. You see, this is a very integrated monument, not something a bunch of white supremacists would want to erect. This is just a small sample of evidence that supports our claim that these monuments were not built to glorify the racist concept of white supremacy, but rather to honor Confederate heroes of all colors. But Ron, what about the Confederate flag? These neo-Marxists claim that the Confederate flag is the flag of slavery. So what do you think about that, Ron?
Well, you know, typically of the neo-Marxists, they are way off base. The Confederate flag has fewer claims to racism than the United States flag has.
Oh, now really? Tell us about that.
Well, after all, the 13 stripes on the U.S. flag represent and symbolize 13 former slave-holding colonies of the United States when we separated or seceded from Great Britain's indivisible empire back in 1776. Of those 13 colonies, the northern states, the New England states, they all were engaged, or most of them were engaged in the nefarious international African slave trade. So by all means, the U.S. flag, the United States flag, has more claim to racism and slavery than the Confederate flag.
So, wait a minute, let me get this straight. The 13 stars on the Confederate flag represent so-called 13 slaveholding states, and you're telling me that the 13 stripes on the United States flag represents 13 slaveholding states?
Absolutely.
Even Massachusetts?
Oh, by all means, Massachusetts.
Well, why is that?
Well, let me see now. How much longer did Massachusetts have slavery than Mississippi?
About 72 years longer.
So Massachusetts had slaves 72 years longer than the state of Mississippi.
Okay.
Very, very interesting. Well, now, what about the captain of the flag? I recall reading something. Captain of the flag and the slave ships.
Yeah, Ron, you'll recognize the Nightingale. It was a beautiful ship that was built in Massachusetts. The captain of it was from New York. It was a Yankee slave trader. It was known as the Queen of the Slave Traders. And I've got a picture here. I'm going to show you here if you look at it. Look at that beautiful ship there, Ron. It's a slave ship. Matter of fact, when that ship was captured, it had 900 slaves on it with a death rate of 6 slaves a day when it was captured. But I want you to look at that. Do you see a Confederate flag on that ship, Ron?
I'm looking, and you know, I see a flag flying, but that doesn't look like the St. Andrew's Cross. It doesn't look like the battle flag. It doesn't look like the Third National, Second
Does
National.
it look like the Mississippi flag?
No, it doesn't look like the Mississippi flag. Now, you know something? That looks like Old Glory, the Stars and Stripes.
Yes, indeed. You see, there's a story there. There was an individual on slave ships of foreign nations that were known as the captain of the flag. He was an American citizen. So when foreign nations were engaged illegally in the African slave trade, their navies could capture their ships and really charge them with piracy and free the slaves. But the United States did not have a treaty with these foreign nations to police their commerce on the sea. So if you had an American citizen on board, what they would do if a European naval vessel approaches an African slave trader, he would execute a bill of sale to the American. Now the American owns that slave vessel and all those slaves. They would hoist up the United States flag and more or less thumb their nose at the authorities on the high sea and go on and sell their slaves, usually in the Caribbean and South America, because you know very few was brought to the United States after 1808. So that was known as the captain of the flag. The captain of the flag was an American citizen. The flag was not a Confederate flag. It wasn't even a Mississippi State flag. It was the flag of the United States. Now, there's an interesting story here, Ron. The United States Congress did not ratify a treaty with the European nations to police our international commerce, but there was a president by the name of John Tyler who saw that this was a loophole that the slave traders were using to illegally bring slaves into the Western Hemisphere. And he spoke to Congress and demanded a treaty with these other nations so that the U.S. could police their commerce and they could police our commerce against the African slave trade. Now, interesting, that's John Tyler. He was from, guess where?
Massachusetts?
No, Virginia. He was the 10th president of the United States from Virginia. Now, interesting enough, he was opposed to the African slave trade. He worked hard to end the African slave trade. When the South had to face secession when Lincoln was elected, he was opposed to secession until Lincoln decided on war. Once Lincoln decided that he would use the power of the federal government to invade sovereign states and force them into a union that they did not want to be in, then President Tyler said, "I've had enough," and he voted for secession. Not only did he vote for secession, he signed the Virginia Ordinance of Secession. And on top of that, he was elected to the Confederate Congress. He was a congressman from Virginia to the Confederate capital in Richmond.
A former president
A former
of the United
president,
States.
the 10th president of the United States, the man that fought against the African slave trade to end the African slave trade into the Western Hemisphere. Now, another little tidbit for you history buffs out there, he is the only president to be buried in a state funeral without the United States flag draping his coffin. You know what flag draped his coffin?
The
Guess.
flag of Massachusetts.
Yeah, you love to hit on Massachusetts. No, it was the flag of the Confederate States of America. So that's just a little interesting aside that we can kind of point out that the idea that the Confederate flag is a flag of slavery, that's a bogus issue. Bogus issue by leftists, progressive, liberals, neo-Marxists. Ron, we could go on for hours about this subject alone, but I have to ask, is there any American symbols that are safe from attack by leftists, liberals, progressive, neo-Marxists?
No, Donald, really, none of our traditions as Americans, as God-fearing people are safe from the neo-Marxists. That's why we all must work together to safeguard American history and liberty. The same groups that attack Confederate history are some of the same people who demand the removal of Christian crosses, the display of the Ten Commandments, and push anti-Christian same-sex marriage agenda.
Well, you know, Ron, you mentioned there the removal of the Ten Commandments. Do you remember, I believe it was under a Republican president, that the federal government ordered Alabama to remove copies of the Ten Commandments from its courthouse. This is Alabama State Courthouse, not federal courthouse. Did this act not tell us a lot about what was lost with the defeat of the Confederate States of America? You know, without real states' rights, there's nothing to stand in the way of an attack upon America's Christian culture, as well as an assault upon traditional American liberty. It's not just the symbols of the South, but traditional American heroes such as George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, Francis Scott Key, the author of the Star-Spangled Banner, and even Christopher Columbus are all being assaulted. We need a way to protect our heritage, our beautiful American Christian heritage, and especially our heritage of liberty. We just can't sit around and hope that the federal government will finally get it right and protect us.
No, darling, we cannot rely upon the guards to protect us. What's the old saying? Who shall guard the guards? Well, the federal government is not the one that our founding fathers entrusted the guardianship of rights and liberties. It was we, the people of the sovereign states. We are the one through real states' rights. For example, the Bible Belt South is compelled by the majority of the secular humanists, progressives in the rest of the country, the liberals, to endorse their agenda, their ideology, their beliefs, all of which conflict with our basic traditional Judeo-Christian ethics and principles. Things that have stood for 2,000 to 4,000 years of Christian tradition and biblical tradition have been challenged by the secular humanists, the progressive. How do we protect that from a government that is controlled by these liberals, progressives, these socialists, neo-Marxists? You do it with real states' rights. And you cannot depend
but
upon
Ron,
the federal government
But
to do
Ron, you said, don't we have states' rights now?
it. We don't have states'
What
rights.
do we have then?
States'
the
rights.
10th Amendment is in the Constitution.
No, my friend. The states' rights died at Appomattox. Lincoln and his cronies killed real states' rights. What we have now is states' privileges. Privileges that the states are allowed to have until the federal government, the secular humanists in the federal government, decide that we don't want you to do that anymore. Your example with the 10 Commandments is exactly on point in Alabama. They had the privilege for almost 150 years, and then all of a sudden that privilege was removed. You can't have things dealing with scripture in your courthouse any longer. The federal government doesn't like it.
Well, let me ask you, what would happen, say, if Thomas Jefferson and James Madison were around and that happened?
Well, it's very similar. We would have nullified the act of the federal government. And anyone that wants to understand that, they need to read the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions of 1798, which was written by Thomas Jefferson and James Madison and endorsed by the legislatures of Kentucky and Virginia, nullifying some very onerous, horrible federal acts that violated the basic Bill of Rights.
And wasn't that act supported by the Supreme Court? So you're telling me that Thomas Jefferson and James Madison didn't think that the federal Supreme Court was the final authority on what is and is not constitutional?
That's right. The Alien and Sedition Act was passed by a Federalist Congress. It was signed by a Federalist President. It was not only endorsed but enforced by a federal Supreme Court. The only defense that the people had was their sovereign state, and that's what James Madison and Thomas Jefferson endorsed. That's real states' rights.
Good. Well, let's hope we get a return to real states' rights. Yes, Ron, these attacks upon all things Confederate and Southern is just a leading wedge in an all-out neo-Marxist attack upon values we hold dear. It's more than just a simple removal of a so-called offensive symbol. If these monuments and flags can be removed because someone is offended, what will happen when an atheist, a deist, a secular humanist, or a Muslim is offended by your display of a Christian flag? If a Confederate monument must be taken down because of the supposed connection with slavery, what will happen when the Constitution is attacked because of its connection with slavery? You see, we are in a cultural battle for the maintenance of Western Christian values. It is time Americans in general and Southerners in particular wake up to this. Thank you for watching this video. Ron and I look forward to visiting with y'all again as Dixie Alliance continues its fight for real American and Christian culture. Thank y'all. Thank you, Ron.